Hi, and welcome to the VDS Shorts, where we'll discuss how to improve Europe in the post-COVID-19 world. Today we're joined by Professor Enrico Perotti, where we'll talk about the divides between northern and southern EU states. Professor Perotti is international finance at the University of Amsterdam and has very kindly accepted today to join us to talk about this complex and interesting topic.
All right, good day to everybody. I teach finance, banking, and financial regulation at the University of Amsterdam. I've been involved in financial regulation a long time at the Bank of England, at the Dutch Central Bank. I'm fundamentally a researcher. So let me describe the construction of the euro, because before we go into the current situation, I would like to explain that there is an economic structure that the countries have committed to, which has consequences. And then we can discuss politics. But there is a lot that is going on that is just driven by the mechanism that was built. So when in the past, we had countries in Europe that were stronger than others, in part because they were sort of fundamentally, let's say, better organized, more cohesive, had relatively good productivity, but really a lot of what their advantage could be seen as being generally a better form of social cohesion and governance. And then there were weaker countries that did a lot to catch up economically, but often they needed to devalue in order to compensate for the sort of internal inefficiency that accumulated over time. Now, the system was so volatile, and everybody had thought that there was something to be gained by coming together in European construction. Certainly, there was a lot to be gained on the real side in terms of making it easier to trade, to integrate. And that's what the European Common Market did. The next step was to do a half step. Essentially, a common currency was created, a common central bank, and there was no further construction added to it. In fact, there were lots of arguments. There were a lot of elements in the treaty that say we shouldn't go beyond the monetary union. That's all we're doing. As a construction, it was a mix of there are clearly economic benefits, but there are also questions about to what extent these two countries could be, two type of country could be locked into the same exchange rate. The benefit for the weaker countries was you get more credibility on the financial monetary side, and so your interest rate go down. For the strong country, it was they did not need to worry about competitive devaluation. And then there was another hidden benefit that not everybody understood, or not fully, but or maybe they did. So what happened is that when you have a strong country with a strong currency and a weak country with a weak currency locking into common currency, the weak country de facto has a revaluation, and the strong country gets a devaluation. Now, this has internal redistributive effect. So, for instance, the savers in the weaker country get richer, and the consumer, but the producer suffer. The opposite is true in the strong country. Productive incentive are strengthened. And that is basically what happened in the euro. What you see is that progressively, in the period of convergence to the euro and after that, we had essentially strong revaluation for the weaker country. And the expectation was, oh, well, there'll be some adjustment. Now, this is the part that was really superficial, at least underestimating the complexity of country to be able to adjust, especially country with weak institutional framework and internal division, some structural weakness. So the net result was that in the good time, everybody benefited. But in the bad time, the weak countries discovered they had been losing territory, they had been losing productive capacity, And they also were losing fiscal capacity, because when you struggle to compete, it's harder to pay your debt, because the tax rate, the same tax rate, is actually more burdensome, because now the debt is high in real terms. And so you have to produce a lot more to just meet the tax. So what I want to transmit is this idea that by locking the two type of country together through this exchange rate, we have distorted a mechanism that was compensating, so that de facto the weaker country lost some fiscal capacity, and the strong country gained in fiscal capacity. This is what I call a hidden transfer, relative to what would have happened in a different world, but it's very much a tangible thing. If you look at the evolution of trade deficit and surplus in the European Union, you can see that they follow exactly the fact that the periphery country lost competitiveness, their wages became too high, a lot of other things, became, the burden of the debt increased, and countries like Germany and Holland, always generally productive and in surplus, went to have extraordinary surpluses thanks to this realignment. Now, this essentially makes a case that from economic point of view, not political, just economic, some form of fiscal redistribution is to some extent legitimate, because there is an implicit transfer on the other side. The difficulty in this argument, which I put forward to Dutch readers in the major newspaper, together with Luis Garicano, my good friend and Europarliamentary, the difficulty is that it's very hard to explain to the Dutch that they owe us something to the Italian, because they see themselves as being hardworking and sort of organized, saving, not spending too much on the government side. And it is a very difficult concept, because it requires understanding the problem as an economist instead of thinking in simple accounting terms, like a lot of debate is. Now, the further difficulty is that even if you talk to the elite and the people understand that, I mean, for instance, the Dutch central bank has done this analysis, and the governor has been clear in indicating that essentially there is some form of legitimacy in the idea of fiscal transfer, though you may not use this exact term. There is also resistance to just transfer money to, say, politicians in the weak country, because there is a proven experience of sort of also not making great use of it. So I think that both at present you have people not recognizing the fact what they gain from at the core, not the gain from the euro. And on the other hand, there is also resistance on the sort of weaker part of the euro to admit that if they receive support, that support cannot be unconditional. It should not be. I mean, so I think that's a bit where we stand. Is an impasse in which people don't fully recognize the game. They do tend to blame each other. And the message is too political. While there is an economic interest in this construction to do something in an appropriate way. So just to conclude this introduction, I think more and more economists and others, including Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who famously was against fiscal support, to recognize that there is some form of solidarity is necessary, yet it cannot be just a handing over of money to some countries, politicians. It has to come through from the center. So it has to be a different entity that directs the spending. Now, just let me remind people that there is, in countries like Italy, there is structural funds that have been committed to the country, and in the end they're not spent because of the really poor capacity of local administration to manage the process. And you can talk about bureaucracy, but I think, quite frankly, there is a structural issue there. So in a sense, what we need is a federal program for specific activity, which is spent from the center, financed collectively, so essentially a fiscal transfer of sort. That's sort of where I want to close my introduction.
Thank you very much for this introduction. From what you said, from what I understand, it sounds like a pretty complex topic with a lot of different actors involved and different interests. So I want to touch on what you mentioned about the Dutch approach and Dutch discourse. Can you describe us maybe why you think that they are taking such a so-called frugal approach to this whole debate, and what are they after? What are their short, medium, and long-term goals, do you think?
Well, I mean, frugal reflects in part a tradition in Netherlands of being fiscally cautious and being generally good at saving. That there is an element of that which is cultural. The Dutch are generally thoughtful about how to spend their money, and I must say, having lived here a long time, you have to admire the fact that they constantly try to sort of squeeze out things in the system that have become, expenditure that are not well justifiable. And I think that is commendable. It's something all countries should do. I mean, I think, for instance, in the Italian debate, it's always impressive, like everybody that talks seems to take the view that the government should spend more on something. It's very rare to hear them say that they should spend less on something. So that, in a sense, is the point, that it's very difficult to let Italy, which, as I say, is a complex and divided country, fully manage this process of tightening expenditure. So having said that, I do think that the Dutch are also complimenting themselves a bit too much, because some of their success is the result of being in the euro. Their success, this is a trading nation par excellence, gain enormously from the common market, more than others. That's fine, everybody gain in general. But they once the euro was created, they got the additional benefit, which they don't fully acknowledge. Now, we all have a tendency to attribute good things to ourselves and blame others for what goes wrong. So there is a bit of that in Italy on the other side too. But in a sense, we all have to come to a more mature view of this. And I want to insist again, this is not a political position. This is just recognizing the economics of the situation. I think right now the Dutch position is very driven by short-term political consideration, medium-term also. I think that's where the attention is. It's very hard to explain to the population without going through the kind of argument I made, what is at stake. What I also don't think anyone is telling them is how severe will be the consequence of sort of a failure of the euro for them. So I don't think they're taking a long-term view. On the other hand, they do understand that if you just a blind form of of fiscal solidarity would not work, and I think in the end they will yield a bit on this sort of new package, but not before it's sort of contained, scaled down a bit.
Now, right now, there is the debate of whether we should approach a loan or grants-based approach to the package and economic reforms that are about to come. What do you think will be a consequence for the euro in these two case scenarios, so grants versus loan, and for the Netherlands as well?
Well, I think that the loan don't solve the problem unless we, and I also am not enthusiastic, because with a loan it's very hard to make conditionality de facto. So, and in any case, they wouldn't really help unless there was a corresponding supporting compensation by the ECB, because quite frankly, the imbalances are now really becoming very salient. So it would just be insufficient. And I think even Merkel decided, after resisting for so many years, after this disastrous decision of imposing a sort of balanced budget in 2009 to avoid being asked any money, with the consequence, among other things, that German infrastructure is deteriorating and other things. I think we moved beyond that childish state, but the scale of what is at stake is not very large. I think what is really missing, though, is before we even talk about larger numbers, is how you'd spend them. And I think I would like to see more convincing and sort of generally convincing way to tie Europe together. I mean, personally, I don't think the subsidizing innovation is the most urgent things we should do with this money. I think we should worry about creating more European infrastructure that ties the countries together in a more immediate way that reaches more people and is more tangible and is more permanent also. Now, again, this should be done, I think, under a more centralized administration.
Yes, you also argued this in a recent opinion piece that was published by the NRC, where you argue that we should give priority to investments that have a clear European value. So you mentioned infrastructure, but you also mentioned a safe external border. So can you maybe give us a few more examples of this type of projects that you think might help make the situation a bit better?
Well, so I think what is needed is areas in which there is a common interest, but national policies struggle. I mean, the common border is an obvious example. I mean, you don't create a political entity without a sense of a common unity, and that's a physical definition. I think we need to reach out into the population with these programs. So I think programs where there is some amount, for instance, maybe modest, but of sort of unemployment insurance, which is centrally provided, would be far superior. Others are also very sensible, like a common effort at a green investment, or also, finally, what I would really encourage is the creation of a more cohesive form of corporate taxation, because right now the countries are just sort of taking advantage of each other. So, I mean, these are natural externalities that need to be addressed. And I think it takes courage and clarity and to sort of identify not too many, but clear tasks to take.
France and Germany recently decided to create a temporary recovery fund of 500 billion euro. What do you think of that measure? And do you think that this can effectively mitigate the economic, but also social consequences of the crisis, and if so, why?
Well, it's definitely the right step in the right direction, and it's sign that also the German leadership is sort of waking up a bit to this. And I think as an emergency entity, it doesn't address a structural issue. So on the other hand, the fact that it talks about grant is much more appropriate. I think I would be happier if, instead of talking larger amount or smaller amount, if we were to talk about the form that this spending would take, because I think that's where progress is needed, so that people at the core, I'm a Dutch taxpayer for 20 years, after all, know where the money is going, and at the same time, people at the receiving end see that there would be something for them which is visible, and it's actually people's sense overdue in some functions, infrastructure, or resolution of externality in a common framework.
Yeah. And talking about the future, do you think that this crisis will actually, because of these steps and what we've seen so far, bring countries together? Or do you see basically any more divisions coming? Or are you optimistic?
I'm not very optimistic. I think it's a divisive shock. I think the Netherlands is lagging behind Germany in recognition, in part because the political elite is playing relatively short term. I do agree that you need to have structural steps taken besides just putting money on the table, but that's not been their position. I see also, I think it's the nature of the virus, because the response to the virus had to happen at the sort of national level. It actually has strengthened national entity versus the more solidaristic entity. And everybody has re-identified on a different scale. So I think it's a serious threat to the idea that we are better off together. I mean, if anyone has the fantasy that you can just sort of continue live as you do and then do without with the euro, I think they're in for a surprise, because the world is complicated. It's very it's linked, and so I'm not optimistic in the short term. I think, on the other hand, Europe has in the past, and I'm talking about the financial crisis, also taken right steps. I mean, for instance, the banking union is an example where you created a sensible common infrastructure that actually improved governance. I mean, the ECB is now able to challenge not just the way in which banks in Portugal or Spain are run, but also in Germany or the Netherlands. And I think there is more distance between regulators and lobbyists, national lobbyists. I think that's a very healthy development.
So the time is almost up, unfortunately, but I have one last question for you, and that is, if you had the power to change something in Europe right now or after Corona, what would it be?
I think it would be an initiative which is coordinated from Brussels, but not located in Brussels, that would involve much more of a grassroots set of operators into creating more common European infrastructure. I mean, the border is one example, but there are others. I mean, I would like to have youth corps in medicine or in other area that sort of, as I say, some kind of form of administration that goes of specific essential services provided from the center in a cost-effective way. There is a way in which you should reach deeper. If you reach deeper and you're seen as part of the solution, then you have a future.
Thank you very much for the time that you gave Volt, and this was a very, very interesting conversation. And well, of course, you're invited, just like everybody else watching, to the next VDS short, where we actually talk about the future relations between the EU and China in a post-COVID-19 world. So you're warmly welcome to join then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.